Let's start with step one, which is painting the big shapes. And that's going to be our front wheel. And I started off with a little bit more paint and then with water on my brush, dragged the color out and making sure there aren't any puddles anywhere. And you can keep adjusting it as long as it's still wet. And next you can paint the back wheel, and we're gonna draw it so it's a little bit smaller because it's further away and more of an ellipse shape because of the angle that we're looking at it from. And now we can paint a little squarish shape, and this is kind of representing like a water bottle holder. And now let's paint the seat of the bike, and it's kind of like a modified V shape. And if you notice, I didn't paint it completely. I left the underside open, and that's because we're gonna use a darker paint to help show that it's in shadow. So adding it while it's wet really encourages that blend. And let's use some of that dark color again to paint the inner part of the wheel. And you don't have to go all the way around, just in some spots to show a little thickness and depth. And let's do that for the back wheel. And you can try to do it in one stroke, but you can also do shorter strokes if that's easier. And now let's paint the handlebar. And I used a slightly darker color than I wanted, so I kind of just wiped it up with a paper towel. And if you ever find that you put down the wrong color, you can use a paper towel and a little bit of water and just dab it in that area, and the paint will be gone. And just like we did for the underside of the seat, I'm adding a darker color to put in the grooves of the handlebar. And for the pedal, we're painting a flattened cube shape, and I like to outline it a little bit and then add water to blend the colors. And for the basket, let's again create the outline with paint and vary the amount of water on your brush, and you can achieve light areas and dark areas. And I use more concentrated paint at the bottom because that's going to be where most of the shadow is. Now that we've put down most of the brown shapes, we can move on to our next color, which is a light blue. And as I'm painting the bar, I'm varying the amount of water on my brush. And so sometimes there will be barely any paint there, other times there will be more paint. So Some areas will be able to get dark and other areas are light. And then staying with the same color, just painting the seat post and then the area where the chain will be. And I'm just making dash marks, not being too precise, but letting the shape of the brush create the strokes. And then there's a little rack. And since the back wheel is dry, you'll be able to layer one color on top of the other without it running too much. And now we can paint that wheel cover. And you can angle your brush so that you can get a more precise, thinner line. And if you mix your browns and your blues, you can achieve a neutral color, so a good gray color. And you can use this to paint the handles. And while we still have that gray on our brush, I'm just taking a look around and seeing where we can add that color. So underneath the seat, there's a little detail there. And then we can paint in the spokes. And they're kind of X shapes and random lines. And the front wheel, we can see more of it. So we're adding in some elements like the hub, and that's just two circles, and I joined them with some horizontal lines. And then I'm adding in the spokes so that some of the lines crisscross, and try to make them very loose, not too precise. And I decided to just wipe that extra line. It looked kind of off, but I think it would have been fine if I left it in anyway. And now we're just painting a circle to represent the gear that attaches to the chain. And then we can drop in the little kickstand. And while we still have the gray, I'm just adding in a vertical line in the front bar. So now we can move on to step 2, which is painting the flowers. Composition tends to look a little better when there's an odd number of objects, so we're just going to paint 3 groups of flowers. So the first one we're starting off with is that blue color, which echoes the color that we used in the bike. And I'm painting scribbly circular shapes, and some of them are lighter, some of them are darker. And then with just water on my brush, I'm pulling down color for some of the stems. And then with more paint on my brush, putting in leaves. and some spots of dark. And now we can paint our next group of flowers. And this is going to be same technique, but we're just using different colors and V shapes this time. And positioning our group of flowers so that when you step back, they form an arc. So the blue ones will be the center, and the pink ones are kind of off to the side. And we painted these light at first and then dropped in a bit of darker color at the base of the petals. And lightly dragging our brush to create those stems and the little leaves. And now I mixed up a yellow orangish color for our final group of flowers. And I like to think of these as loops. So some of them will keep them open, while others I'll fill it in with color, just for that variation. So it's just all about variety and changing up the lightness and darkness of your color. And then pull down to add the stems. And again, go ahead and put in leaves wherever your bouquet needs it. And since we want them to look like they're sitting in the basket, we can go ahead and paint the stems so that they overlap. And it can be random. They don't necessarily have to meet up anywhere up top. We just want to kind of give the illusion of fullness. And you can take a look at your composition and see if there are any gaps that you want to add more green or more flowers, and try to keep them relatively light if they're going to be in the back. So they're kind of a little bit faded. If you want to add them to the front, use a slightly darker color. And then when you're ready, we can move on to the next step. Now that we have the big shapes and the flowers put in, all we need to do is work on the details. For example, we can put in a little light at the front and at the back, and then under the seat. So these are just nice spots of color. And then I'm outlining the petal. And everything in this stage, we're using mostly paint, very little water. And you can either use a smaller brush or have a little bit more control by gripping it a little bit lower. So using a dark mix, which you can achieve with mixing your browns and your blues, I'm putting in little lines to define some of the hub, and then adding little dots to areas in the spokes. I'm just angling my brush on the side to get that shape. And then underneath the handles, putting in a dark line to define it. You can go really slowly so that you don't disturb any other areas. So we're kind of just mark making and putting in dashes and dots. And we can even add some squiggly lines to represent maybe the chain of the bike. and some design on our water bottle holder. And now we can add some texture to our tires by I'm using like a burnt sienna color and just putting in dashes and some dots along the outer rim of the tires. And you can repeat that at the front as well. And I'm trying not to clutter it too much and just taking a step back after I place a texture mark. And I'm just noticing the color ran a little bit. So I'm taking a white gel pen and just dulling down the color so that it'll fade in more. And you can make little adjustments to your illustration as you see them. And we can put in a few more darks in the tires and define the underside of our basket a little bit. And I'm just painting over the lines that we already drew with a darker color. And now we can move on to our final stage where we're putting in our shadows and highlights. So I'm mixing up a grayish color by again using some of our blues and browns. And then I lay down my brush with the paint and with a little bit of water dragging out the rest, making the shape pretty irregular and lightening it up as you move away from the tire. And now we can put in some of those whites. So with the gel pen or a paint pen, I'm picking out spots that have some dark areas and then just dabbing in the white there, like in the hub, around the tire, maybe in the basket, and in the blue areas. And these are really good, especially for when you're painting objects that are made of metal, because it'll give you that shine. And there's one last thing we can add, and that's some string to attach the basket to our bike. And so with your thin brush and just dark paint, I'm dragging a curved line from the bottom of the basket down to the hub of the wheel. And we're going to do that on both sides. And actually, the one on the right should be behind the wheel, so you don't want to draw in front of it like I did. but I don't think anybody will notice or mind. So if you painted it in front, it's okay. And I'm just adding a little bit more shadow on the side of the seat. And with a slightly darker blue, which you can get by mixing a little bit of your brown into it, we're going to outline some of the underside of the bars just to give it a tad more definition. And when everything is dry, you can erase any pencil marks. And in 4 steps, we are able to paint this very cheery bike with flowers. So we started off with big shapes, then we moved on to the flowers, added some details, and then completed it with shadows and highlights.